CRIJ 1301, Introduction to Criminal Justice, Unit 6. This is the beginning of the first of 3 units dealing with law enforcement, and specifically law enforcement in the United States for the most part. But before we can talk about the history of American policing, we've got to go back to England. We've got to go hundreds of years in the past in England. Because policing really starts, our American tradition of policing really starts in medieval England with a system called the tithing system. And I'm not talking about, how much money you put in a little plate at the church on Sunday morning. In this context, the tithing was a private self-help protection system in medieval England. And it involved a group of 10 families, or a tithing, which collectively agreed to follow the law, keep the peace in their area, and work together to bring violators to justice. Now, a group of 10 tithings, which would be 100 families, 10 times 10, was called 100. And then those hundreds were grouped together to form what was called a shire. And yes, for you J.R.R. Tolkien fans out there, this is where he gets the concept of the shire, or at least the word. A shire would operate under the direction of a shire reeve. And note, if you say the term shire reeve quickly enough and often enough, it'll start to sound like sheriff. And it ought to, because that is the forerunner of the American sheriff. The shire reeve would handle the capture of offenders. But of course, the shire reeve is just one person. And so he would get a bunch of able-bodied citizens together to help him capture outlaws and bandits and bad guys. And that group of people that he would get together to go hunt down bad guys was called a posse. And here I bet you thought a posse was just something from the American Western movies, but no, it's something that harkens back to merry old England, like most of our law enforcement traditions. But the shire reeve system and the tithing system is something that largely happened out in the rural areas of England. Within the cities, after the Norman conquest of 1066, we see the establishment of something called the Night Watch. And the idea was the Night Watch, and their job was to protect the interest of people in the cities. And their primary job was to watch for enemy attacks and keep an eye out for fires. Because, when your entire town and all the buildings in your town are made out of wood, fires are a bad thing. And then they also looked out for criminals, dangerous criminals. Now, they weren't police. We haven't gotten to a point in history yet where police are a thing. In fact, police and formal law enforcement like the police is a fairly new concept, only been around for a few hundred years. And the Night Watch is kind of the closest we get to it for a while. But their job was, you saw a bad guy, you saw a fire, you saw the enemy coming, and you were to alert the population. You were to alert people and say, hey, bad things are happening, wake up. And they would have little whistles to blow or little rattles to rattle to wake people up. And this alert was called the hue and cry. It's 3 words: hue, H-U-E, and cry. And I specify it like that because I've been teaching this for over a decade, and it probably has to do with the way I enunciate the phrase hue and cry. But forever and ever, I get students that call it the human cry on tests. I'm like, that's not what it is. It's hue and cry, basically shouting for help. In addition, there you had, in addition to the Night Watch, you had the ward. They were responsible for doing the same thing the Night Watch did, but only during the day. But they had a few more duties. They were responsible for clearing refuge from the city. They would take bodies of people who died overnight and go take them out to the city walls and burn them. And both the Night Watch and the ward were supervised by a constable who was a government official. And the constable, like I said, he supervised the watch, he supervised the ward. Most often he just kind of drafted people into the watch and the ward. And so you kind of got he got what he got. Usually it was, the dregs of society that were members of the watch in the war. They were the drunk and the homeless. They were, the petty criminals that you went, okay, you can serve, you're going to serve your punishment. You did this minor crime, or you're a vagrant, or, you're a drunkard or whatever, and you're going to serve out your punishment by being a member of the watch. Yay. Now, this was kind of an informal system in most English cities until 1285 with the Statute of Winchester. And with the Statute of Winchester in 1285, we see the constable watch system get formalized into British law. The statute or law required all able-bodied men to keep weapons in their home. And anytime the hue and cry was raised, they were responsible for coming out and helping. And that was the way, and that was the extent of law enforcement. And so if you say there are two notable features of this constable watch system, particularly after it was formalized in 1285 by the Statute of Winchester, we're talking about first that the people were the police. And we're not talking about uniformed police watching the streets. It's these guys on the watch, these guys in the ward, they're roaming around at night, with a little whistle or their rattle, and then all citizens were required to have a weapon of some sort right by the door. In fact, they had required by the Statute of Winchester to have a weapon by the door and a bucket. And if the watch raised the hue and cry, if the hue and cry was about fire, you were required by law to grab your bucket and go help put up fire. And if the hue and cry was raised because of some criminal in the area, you were required to grab your weapon and go and help. And if you failed to do so, you were in violation of the law. And usually your punishment was, you guessed it, to be a member of the watch. The second notable feature of the system is that the organization of protection was local. That rather than being a nationwide police force, which doesn't exist at this time, all of the constable watch system, it's all very local. It's all divided by precincts. And this is the state of law enforcement in England for the next 500 years. In 1748, along comes a man named Henry Fielding, and he develops a private detective force called the Bow Street Runners. And Henry Fielding, he was a London magistrate, he was a judge, and he built this private detective force for the purpose of apprehending criminals and recovering stolen property in the entertainment district in London. And they were fairly successful. In fact, they were probably the most successful law enforcement organization of the time, certainly the closest thing you had to law enforcement. And there were attempts to duplicate the success of the Bow Street Runners in other parts of London. No one was really as successful as Henry Fielding was. But Henry Fielding's success then leads to other people having ideas. One of those people was a man named Robert Peel. And Robert Peel, and he comes into the time of the Industrial Revolution. And at the time of the Industrial Revolution, you start to see masses of people moving from the rural areas into the cities, from the farms and the outlying shires and counties into London proper. And you got a lot more homeless, you've got a lot more crime, and because there were more people than there were jobs. Because everyone goes, oh, let's go to the city and get jobs, and well, eventually, there's only so many jobs, and there's certainly a lot more people than there are jobs, and it starts creating problems for the city of London. And Robert Peel proposes to Parliament this idea of a police force. And he initially wants, and the first time he presents it to Parliament, tells him, no, Bobby, you can't have this. And things get a little worse, and Robert Peel goes back to Parliament, and Parliament says, okay, Bobby, you can have what you want, but you got to run the thing. So you want to create this thing, uh, and you want to call it the London Metropolitan Police Force, that's fine, but you have to run it. If you want to do this thing, you got to be in charge. And Robert Peel says, okay. And the act creates a 1,000-man police force. Now you don't get 1,000 people all at once. I mean, Robert Peel builds the London Metropolitan Police over time, but the act provided for 1,000 police officers. And one of the first things Robert Peel does is he develops his principles of policing. And I want you to listen careful to the principles of policing, because they should sound familiar to you. If you think about American policing today, not 100 years ago, talking about American policing today, you'll note that we are still continuing to follow most of the traditions of Robert Peel's principles of policing. And so those principles included, first, that the police must be stable, efficient, and organized along military lines. In other words, it needs to be a paramilitary organization. Think about modern police. Modern police have ranks. You got your troopers, but you got sergeants and lieutenants and majors and the police chief. It's very, you get the uniforms. It's all very paramilitary. Begins with Robert Peel, by the way, who eventually becomes Sir Robert Peel. And his police officers, the officers that worked for the London Metropolitan Police, they were called one of two things back at the time. They were called Peelers, because, Sir Robert Peel, but they were also called by Sir Robert Peel's nickname, Bobby. And so if you ever wonder why British police officers are called Bobbies, they've been called Bobbies since the very foundation of the London Metropolitan Police Force, because that was the nickname of Sir Robert Peel, the founder of that police force. It is the oldest law enforcement organization in the world. Also the first formal law enforcement agency in the world. Anyway, back to the principles of policing. They also include the deployment of police strength by both time and area are essential. We do that today. He said that no quality is more indispensable to a policeman than perfect command of temper. He said good appearance commands respect. And so, the Bobbies were, they wore their uniforms and they were clean and they were very crisp in their uniforms, because the idea was you had to look good. If you looked like you were a person of authority, people would treat you like you were a person of authority, rather if you were just a slob. He said that public security demands that every police officer be given a number. And even today, if you look at a police officer's badge, it has a number on it. And every police officer has a badge number. Again, it goes all the way back to Robert Peel. Robert Peel also said that police headquarters should be centrally located and easily accessible to the people. Now, that is something we've moved away from, especially in cities like New York, where you have police departments, spread out. But the idea that the police department is easily accessible to the people is something that we still continue. He said policemen should be hired on a probationary period. Anybody who's hired as a police officer spends 12 months in a probationary period, in a training period. If you're not, you spend that 12 months with a field training officer, an FTO, who evaluates whether or not it is appropriate for you to be a police officer. And then finally, he said police records are necessary for the correct distribution of police strength. And again, these are all things that modern American policing does. And it all starts with Sir Robert Peel, his principles of policing developed in the creation of the London Metropolitan Police Department. All right, in our next segment, we'll talk about the development of the police in the United States.